I understand that the TED conference is an opportunity for many people from science and generally successful people to hear stories with unique experiences that will be useful to a wide range of people. I am a self-taught researcher, and I want to share the experience of how I took on a seemingly unsolvable problem from science and not only solved it, but even managed to succeed in studying topics that are considered the most difficult by science. Modern science is faced with the problem of the lack of a fresh look at the unresolved problems of the science of consciousness, psychology, neuroscience, economics, philosophy. Because my story is perfect for a TED conference, at the very drain of my desire to understand the unknown was the desire to find a scientific justification for body language, to understand how to consciously find the meaning of my subconscious gestures, because I understood that all people subconsciously take the position of the body depending on the state, and those designations about which in books about body language they are not satisfied in any way because of their scientific groundlessness and anti-science. The first fact that I took as the basis of my own study of gestures was what I learned from neuroscientists. It turns out that the motor and sensory pathways in the human brain are localized at the level of the brainstem, which means that all people who come out of the right and left hemisphere of the brain, and what the left front body does, they come out of the right hemisphere of the brain, localization. That is why, with a stroke hemorrhage in the right hemisphere of the brain, it paralyzes the opposite left side of the body, and with a stroke in the left hemisphere, it paralyzes the right side of the body. Knowing this, I made a simple conclusion that is a priori. That is, it is impossible to err in it, which means that this is an excellent scientific approach and a foundation on which to build scientific conclusions. When I found out that all gestures are divided into the right and left sides of the body, I began to look for whether there is a difference, and if there is, what is it? And along the way, I was looking for all the information about the difference between the hemispheres of the brain, because if the hemispheres of the brain that make gestures are different, then the gestures should also be the same. Further, I simply accumulated experience that cannot be expressed in words because of its large volume. As a result of such a uniquely constructed method, I am now simply far ahead of what is known to modern science. Later, I was already able to distinguish the meaning of gestures from the right side of the body from the left side of the body, with dozens of terms from philosophy, psychology, the science of consciousness, and concluded that the hemispheres of the brain differ in the same way, and began to look for someone to tell, because I found a method that modern science in it cannot prove the differences between the hemispheres of the brain, and is forced to assert that the brain works only as a whole, forgetting that Roger Walcott Sperry, conducting an experiment with animals to dissect the corpus callosum, connects the hemispheres of the brain, demonstrated that the information present in the visual form in one hemisphere is not determined by the other hemisphere. When I began to understand very well, I suddenly made a discovery that I consider one of the most amazing, which the whole world should know about, for which I hope to receive the Nobel Prize someday, and I am sure that I will get it if I speak at TED. Then my speech will cause an international outcry, and all scientists in many of the most important fields of science will begin to discuss it, and even to experiment to see if my discovery is true. Opening. Knowing in many aspects how the hemispheres of the brain differ, seeing in real life and on video from YouTube a lot of gestures on the right and left sides of the body, and consciously knowing which hemisphere of the brain the gesture comes from, I began to notice that all people always keep their heads slightly tilted to the side of that hemispheres of the brain, whose differences are manifested in the behavior and mood of this person. I thought that if this is not an accident, then it would mean that I made a discovery that all people switch two types of consciousness, by a normal tilt of the head, then to the right side, then to the left. Naturally, I decided that this was too unrealistic, and brushed it off ideas to check it. But then I noticed it again, and then again, and seeing it all the time, I realized that it was worth checking, and it turned out that it was. All people simply tilt their heads to the leading hemisphere of the brain. From the moment I can watch any person see some hemisphere of the brain that is leading, just by seeing on which side the head is tilted at the moment. And I see at what moment the leading hemisphere of the brain switches, because at such a moment, the head of a person simply tilts from one hemisphere of the brain to the opposite. I am sure that this is already enough to speak at the TED conference. However, if there is time and desire, I can tell a lot of everything that follows from this. This will determine what will be studied by all types of sciences in any field for more than 100 years ahead. I managed to discover a method of how to see which hemisphere of the brain is leading. And even more, I checked it and found out that if you specifically change the tilt of the head, then the consciousness will begin to correspond to that format, when the one that is lower becomes the leader. I will wait for your comments. I can become the first citizen of Kazakhstan to receive the Nobel Prize. If you help me, then it turns out you will help raise the status of the whole of Kazakhstan.